The council hall smelled of melted wax and poorly disguised pride. Sadie walked through the oak gates with her head high and her shoulders tight, carrying in her hands the only decent dress she owned. Dark gray, hemmed with threads her mother had sewn by hand in the last months before she died. It was not a noble's dress. There were no gemstones at the neckline, no imported lace from the northern territories. But every stitch along that hem had been placed with a fine needle and quiet love, and that made the fabric heavier than any purchased silk. The great gathering of the packs happened once a year in Varn Hall, neutral ground between the 5 main clans. It was the night when alliances were forged, promises were kept, and wolves of lineage presented their children, their choices, and their bonds before everyone. For most of those present, it was politics. For Sadie, it was the night Cole Heron had promised, with his hands around hers and his eyes on hers, that he would present her to the pack as his chosen companion. He had made that promise 3 months ago. He had repeated it 2 weeks before. He had looked at her last night as though the promise still existed. She believed it because she wanted to believe, because she was 24 years old and had spent her entire life being called inadequate. Daughter of a clanless mother and an unknown father, raised on the edges of Heron territory with no noble blood, no connection to any recognized pack. Cole was the son of the Heron pack's beta, not the most powerful man in the hall, but the first who had ever looked at her as though she had real value, or so she had thought. "You look beautiful," said Petra, appearing at her side with a cup of red wine, and that crooked smile Sadie had known since childhood. Petra was small, with hair the color of burnt chestnut, and a temperament capable of setting an entire forest on fire. She was the only person Sadie called a friend without having to think twice. "They're going to look at you and swallow their tongues." "I don't need them to look," Sadie replied, accepting the cup, but not drinking. "I just need Cole to keep his word." Petra made that expression, the one Sadie had learned to recognize over the years, a mixture of contained worry and fierce loyalty, but she said nothing. She simply walked beside her through the central corridor of the hall, where the banquet tables were arranged in a semicircle, covered in candles and dark wine jugs, and where the representatives of each pack were already positioned with the formality of people who know exactly where they belong. The Heron pack's crest, a silver wolf on a black field, hung from one of the stone columns to the left. Sadie found Cole before she had even crossed half the hall. He stood between 2 older men, his father's brothers, with the rigid posture of someone being watched. Dark hair, broad shoulders, the kind of appearance that convinced people there was substance underneath. He saw her. For 1 second, just 1 second, something crossed his face. She wanted to believe it was relief. She wanted to believe it was affection. Then he looked away and returned to speaking with his uncles as though she did not exist, and Sadie's stomach dropped several inches. "Maybe he's waiting for the right moment," she said, more to herself than to Petra. "Maybe," Petra answered carefully. The council was opened by Lord Varn himself, an old wolf with completely white hair and authority built across decades of arbitrating between clans. He spoke about balance, about territory, about the rogues that had been spotted on the eastern edge of the forests over the past few weeks, packless wolves, lawless, uncontrolled, who posed a danger to anyone traveling alone. Sadie listened carefully while scanning the hall. It was then that she felt it, not a scent she recognized, not pine resin like Heron territory, nor cured leather like the southern warriors. It was something deeper, ancient wood and cold rain, and something that had no name, only weight. The kind of presence that arrived before the person, that shifted the temperature of the air before the eyes could confirm its source. She did not search for the origin, not in that moment, because Lord Varn was yielding the floor to the formal presentations, and Cole had moved. He was walking toward the center of the hall, where promises were declared before witnesses. Sadie's heart beat harder. She straightened her shoulders, held the cup more firmly. Cole stopped at the center. He looked at the crowd. Then, with a voice that carried the right tone of formality and the wrong inflection of someone reciting a speech he did not believe, he said, "I announce my choice of companion before the assembled packs." Sadie took a step forward. Cole looked to the right. A young woman stepped away from the Heron family table. Sadie recognized her in under 2 seconds. Mira Connell, daughter of the Connell pack's alpha, red hair, a burgundy dress, the expression of someone who had known exactly what was happening and had known it long enough not to be surprised. Mira crossed the hall with the elegance of someone taught from childhood to occupy public spaces, and stopped beside Cole with the naturalness of a piece clicking into place. The hall murmured. It was a murmur of approval, that collective sound that means it makes sense. It was expected. A good alliance. Sadie did not move, not because she was paralyzed, but because her body had made a choice before her mind could interfere. Staying still was better than taking a wrong step, better than stumbling, better than showing the entire hall that she had believed in something that had never been real. Petra arrived at her side so silently that Sadie barely felt her. A small, firm hand touched her elbow. Not to guide her, only to say I'm here. Sadie exhaled slowly. The dress her mother had embroidered suddenly felt much heavier. Someone beside them, a woman from the Varn pack that Sadie did not know, leaned toward her companion and whispered with the careless volume of someone who does not worry about being heard. Was that the clanless one he was courting? Poor thing. Someone should have warned her this was never really going to happen. Cole was always pragmatic, the other replied, with the same carelessness. A beta doesn't bind himself to no blood. Sadie turned her face slightly to the side. Not to confront them, to keep them from seeing the impact of those words in her eyes. She was leaving. She had already decided. Set the cup down, turn her back, cross the hall with her spine straight, and walk out through the oak gates with the same composure she had walked in with. It was the only way to preserve any piece of dignity that still belonged to her. She took 2 steps toward the side exit. That was when the sound came, not a scream. Something worse. The sudden silence that precedes something serious. The kind of silence an entire hall makes when it realizes the danger has already entered, before anyone could close the door. The rogue wolf was at the eastern entrance. Sadie saw him at the same moment as everyone else. Large, uncontrolled, his shift halfway through, human form corrupted by instinct. Eyes completely yellow, no recognition, no reason, dried blood on the side of his neck. A rogue in collapse was more dangerous than a wild wolf, because there was no longer any calculation behind the movements, only impulse. The hall pulled back. It was an instinctive motion, warriors seeking distance to assess, nobles retreating on instinct, some pushing others without ceremony. In the half-second chaos that settled in, one figure was left behind. A boy, son of some minor representative, who had tripped and fallen between the tables, directly in the rogue's path. Sadie counted less than 3 seconds of collective paralysis. There was no warrior positioned between the rogue and the child. Those who were armed were on the far side of the hall. Cole had pulled back with his uncles. Lord Varn was shouting orders that no one was carrying out fast enough. Sadie did not think. She moved. Later, when she tried to reconstruct the moment in her memory, she would not be able to explain where the clarity had come from. It was not calculated courage. It was the kind of thing the body does when the mind is still trying to find reasons not to act. She crossed the open space toward the rogue, placing herself between him and the child on the floor, and raised her arms, not to attack, but to occupy space, to be a presence large enough to redirect the attention of the unraveling wolf. The rogue focused on her. She saw the yellow eyes lock onto her and felt the real weight of it. Not exactly fear, but the physiological recognition of danger that raises every hair on both arms at the same time. "Hey," she said, her voice low and steady. She did not shout. Shouting would have been a mistake. "Look at me." The rogue growled, lowered his body into an attack position. And it was exactly at that moment, when the hall was motionless, when no one had moved to help her, when Sadie stood alone 3 meters from a collapsing wolf, with nothing but her own body between him and a child on the floor, that she felt that scent again. Ancient wood. Cold rain. Something nameless. Only wait. And a voice, low as distant thunder, said behind her, "Don't move." She did not move, not because the voice had commanded it. Sadie had stopped taking orders from men she did not know, at an age when most girls were still learning to be afraid of them. She stayed still because her body recognized, before her mind could confirm it, that whoever stood behind her was not another spectator. The air around her had changed. The pressure of the room had shifted the way it shifts before a storm breaks. Not louder, but denser. The rogue felt it too. She watched it happen in real time. The yellow eyes flickered. The lowered body hesitated, muscles coiling, and then, not releasing. The growl that had been building in the rogue's chest, broke apart into something smaller, something confused. A wolf in full collapse did not hesitate. A wolf in full collapse did not recalculate. But this one did, and Sadie understood why half a second later, when the presence behind her stepped forward and drew level with her left shoulder. She did not look at him yet. She kept her eyes on the rogue, but her peripheral vision registered height, breadth, the dark edge of a cloak, and the kind of absolute stillness that very few people ever truly achieve. The stillness of someone for whom the room has never once been threatening. The rogue whined. It was a small sound, almost pathetic in a creature that size. And it came from somewhere beneath the collapse, from whatever remained of the wolf's instincts that had not yet been consumed by the madness. That remaining piece recognized what was standing in the room, recognized it the way a smaller fire recognizes a larger one. The man beside her spoke again. Same low register, no urgency. Down. It was a single word. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The rogue dropped. Not slowly, not with resistance. Dropped, fully, forelegs hitting the stone floor, and head lowering until his jaw nearly touched the ground. A sound came out of him that was somewhere between a whimper and an exhale, and then he was still, not unconscious, subdued. The way a wolf is subdued when something far above its rank makes the air impossible to breathe against. The hall remained silent for another 3 full seconds. Then it erupted. Sadie exhaled. It came out shakier than she would have liked, and she pressed her lips together immediately after, resetting her expression before she turned. The child behind her was already being pulled to safety by 2 adults who had found their courage now that the danger had been neutralized by someone else. She watched them go without saying anything. Then she turned. There were 3 of them. She absorbed that in layers, the way the mind processes things that are too large to take in all at once. The first thing she registered was that none of them looked like the men in this hall. Not in dress. They wore dark traveling cloaks, road-worn, no ceremonial finery, no pack banners pinned to their shoulders. Not in posture. The men of this hall stood with the careful rigidity of people performing status. These 3 stood the way terrain stands, simply present. Immovable without effort. The one on the left was grinning. He was lean and sharp-featured with dark eyes that moved over everything in the room, the way a blade moves over a whetstone. Quickly, with purpose. He looked at Sadie with open, unguarded interest, and did not pretend otherwise. "Well," he said, to no one in particular, "that was either the bravest thing I've seen in 5 years or the most insane. I genuinely cannot decide." "Both," said the one on the right, without looking up. He was broader, arms crossed, scanning the hall with the particular boredom of someone who finds most situations beneath comment. He had the kind of jaw that suggested he had been punched in it a considerable number of times and had not particularly minded. It was both. Sadie looked at the man in the center. He was looking at her. Not the way the hall had looked at her when she walked in, assessing worth, cataloging status, measuring how much space she was allowed to occupy. He was looking at her the way someone looks at something they already know the value of, and are simply confirming the appraisal. He was tall. Not excessively so, but built with the kind of density that suggested the height was structural, not decorative. Dark hair, slightly unkempt from travel. A jaw that carried a few days of shadow. And eyes. Gray. Not the warm gray of clouded skies, but the cold gray of stone under running water, that had not moved from her face since she turned. He said nothing. The one on the left, the sharp-featured one, leaned slightly toward him and said with theatrical helpfulness, "You could introduce yourself. It's generally considered polite after someone does something like that in front of you." The man in the center did not look at him. He kept his gaze on Sadie. "Aiden," he said, "just the name. Nothing attached to it, no title, no pack affiliation, no explanation." As though the name itself was sufficient information. It was. Sadie felt it move through the room. Not a gasp, but that specific quality of collective recalibration that happens when a name lands with more weight than anticipated. She saw it in her peripheral vision. Backs straightening, heads turning. The subtle repositioning of bodies that people do when they suddenly understand who is in the space with them. Lord Varn, across the hall, had gone very still. Aiden, Alpha King, ruler of the northern high seat, the wolf above all wolves in the known territories. Sadie held his gaze. She was not certain why she did not look away. Social conditioning alone should have dropped her eyes immediately. You did not hold the gaze of an alpha king the way you held the gaze of an equal. But something in the quality of his attention made looking away feel like the wrong response, not defiant, not deliberate. Simply, she looked at him because he was looking at her, and looking away felt like flinching, and she had already decided tonight that she was done flinching. Sadie, she said. No family name. She did not have one worth giving in a room like this, and she had learned a long time ago that offering something hollow was worse than offering nothing. Something shifted in his expression. It was small, the faintest adjustment around the eyes, and it was over before she could be certain she had seen it. The sharp-featured man on the left made a quiet sound that might have been a laugh immediately suppressed. "Are you injured?" Aiden asked. The question surprised her, not because it was unexpected. She had just stood in front of a rogue, but because of how he asked it. Direct. No performance of concern, no theatrical gentleness, just the question. "No," she said. He nodded once. Then he looked past her, at the rogue still lying subdued on the floor, and something in his face changed from neutral to something considerably colder. "Restrain him," he said, and two men she had not noticed before materialized from near the entrance and moved toward the rogue with practiced efficiency. The hall was finding its voice again. She could hear it rebuilding around her, conversations resuming, the specific elevated murmur of people processing something they had just witnessed. She heard fragments. "Who is she? Did you see that? She just walked straight at it. Who does that?" And beneath those, quieter, the ones that had always followed her, clanless. No blood. What was she thinking? Petra appeared at her elbow. Her face was doing something complicated. Equal parts residual terror and fierce, burning pride. "You absolute disaster," Petra said, in a voice so low only Sadie could hear it. "I aged 10 years in 30 seconds. You're fine," Sadie said. "I am not fine." Petra's hand found her arm and gripped it. "I am the opposite of fine, but I am also extremely proud of you. Which is very inconvenient right now." Sadie almost smiled. Almost. Because Cole was crossing the hall toward her. She saw him coming and felt nothing that surprised her. No residual hope. No leftover warmth. Just a kind of tired clarity. The way you feel when a thing you were already certain of is finally confirmed. He was walking with the expression of a man who has realized he needs to manage a situation, not with the expression of a man who feels anything real. He stopped a few feet away. His eyes moved briefly to the 3 men still standing behind her, and something in his posture recalculated visibly. "Sadie," he said. His voice carried the careful tone of public performance. "That was reckless. You could have been—" "Cole." It was Aiden's voice, still low, still unhurried. But it stopped Cole with the efficiency of a wall. Cole turned, fully took in who he was looking at. The color shifted in his face. "She is not yours to address," Aiden said. Not loudly, not with particular heat, with the specific flatness of a man stating a fact that he does not expect to need to repeat. The hall heard it. Every word. Cole's mouth opened, closed. He looked at Sadie with something in his eyes that might have been the beginning of understanding. Too late, too slow, arriving at the wrong moment entirely. Then he stepped back, and kept stepping back, and said nothing else. Sadie did not watch him go. She did not need to. She was looking at Aiden, who was already looking at her, and the sharp-featured man on his left had both hands pressed over his mouth in a way that suggested he was exercising considerable restraint. They gave her a room. She had not asked for one. Lord Varn had appeared at her side approximately 4 minutes after the rogue had been removed from the hall, carried out by Aiden's men with the quiet efficiency of people who handled disruptions professionally, and informed her, with the careful tone of a man who was reassessing several things simultaneously, that a guest chamber had been prepared. She understood without being told that the offer was connected to the 3 men who had watched the entire exchange from the center of the hall without moving. Petra had squeezed her hand once and said she would find her in the morning. The room was stone-walled and simply furnished. A bed with heavy wool blankets, a fire already burning in the hearth, a basin of water on the table near the window. Sadie sat on the edge of the bed, still in her mother's dress, and pressed her palms flat against her knees, and breathed. The rogue's yellow eyes kept appearing behind hers when she closed them. Not with fear. The fear had never fully arrived, which she suspected was a problem she would examine later. What kept returning was the weight of standing in that open space with nothing between her and the collapse except her own decision to be there. It had not felt heroic in the moment. It had felt like arithmetic, a child on the floor, a wolf 3 meters away, no one moving. The sum of those 3 things had only one answer. She unbraided her hair without thinking about it, fingers working through the knots automatically while her mind moved elsewhere. To Cole, briefly. But that door had closed so cleanly that there was almost nothing to examine on the other side. What she felt was not heartbreak. It was the specific exhaustion of having carried hope for something that had never been as solid as she needed it to be, and finally being able to put it down. What her mind kept returning to instead was gray eyes. The quality of attention in them, the way he had said her name back to her, not repeating it, not acknowledging it, simply receiving it, as though it was a piece of information he was filing somewhere specific. A knock at the door. She crossed the room and opened it. The sharp-featured man stood in the corridor with his hands in his pockets, and an expression of complete innocence that she did not believe for a single moment. "Zev," he said, when she just looked at him. "Since we skipped that part earlier, the large one's name is Dorian. He doesn't talk much, but he has excellent opinions. What do you want?" she asked. "Technically nothing. I was sent to ask if you needed anything, which is a polite fiction for Aiden wanted to know if you were all right but would not send himself because that would be too legible, and he finds legibility uncomfortable." He paused. "I'm paraphrasing slightly." Sadie studied him for a moment. Up close, Zev had the particular energy of someone who was considerably more observant than he appeared. The humor was genuine, but it was also a layer, worn easily and deployed strategically. She had known enough people who used lightness as camouflage to recognize the pattern. "I'm fine," she said. "You stood in front of a collapsing rogue with no weapon and no backup," he said pleasantly. "You're allowed to be slightly not fine. I'm aware of what I did. I know." He tilted his head. "That's actually why I'm here." A pause, and the pleasantness shifted by a fraction, becoming something more direct. "Where did you learn to do that?" She leaned against the doorframe. "Do what?" "The voice. The positioning. You placed yourself at exactly the right angle to interrupt his sight line to the child without giving him a direct frontal challenge. That's not instinct. That's knowledge." Sadie was quiet for a moment, outside the narrow window at the end of the corridor. The forest pressed dark and close against the walls of Varn Hall, and the wind moved through it with a sound like breathing. "My mother lived near the border territories for a long time," she said finally. "Rogue crossings weren't unusual. She taught me what she knew." Zev absorbed this. Something in his expression settled into something more genuine. "Your mother sounds like she was worth knowing." "She was," Sadie said. A beat of silence, not uncomfortable. "He really did send you to check on me?" she asked. "He really did." Zev straightened. "He also wants to speak with you in the morning if you're willing. Breakfast, in the East Courtyard. Low ceremony, no audience." He paused. "He asked me to tell you it's not a summons. He used the word willing specifically. I noticed that too, in case you were wondering." She was wondering. She did not say so. "I'll think about it," she said. Zev smiled. The real version, not the performed one. That's the most honest answer anyone's given him in recent memory. He stepped back. "Good night, Sadie." She closed the door and stood with her back against the wood for a moment, looking at the fire. She went to breakfast. The East Courtyard was smaller than she expected. A stone-paved square open to the sky, with a table set simply near the far wall where climbing ivy had gone brown with the season. 2 cups, bread, cheese, a jar of dark preserves. No ceremony, no audience as promised. Aiden was already there. He stood with his back to her when she entered, looking out at the tree line beyond the courtyard wall. He had changed from the traveling cloak, now a plain dark shirt, sleeves pushed to the forearms, no armor, no formal dress. It was the kind of deliberate casualness that communicated something specific. "I am not performing for you this morning." He turned when he heard her step. "You came," he said. "You said it wasn't a summons," she replied. "I wanted to see if you meant it." Something in the gray eyes shifted. That small, precise adjustment she had noticed the night before. He gestured toward the table without further comment. They sat. She poured her own cup. He did not reach across to do it for her, and did not comment on the fact that she had done it herself, and she noted both of those things. "You're not what Lord Varn's reports described," he said after a moment. "You had reports on me." The question came out more direct than she planned. "I had reports on everyone present at last night's gathering." He looked at his cup. His description was, "clanless ward of the Heron border." A pause. "It was insufficient. Most descriptions of me are," she said. "I know." He said it without particular inflection, as though it was simply a fact he had arrived at and was stating. "You were raised on the border territories. The eastern edge. For most of my life. Alone? With my mother. Until I wasn't." He did not press. Did not fill the silence with condolence or deflection. He simply let the information exist in the space between them, and she found, unexpectedly, that she did not mind. "The rogue last night," he said. "He came from my territories." She looked up. "He crossed 3 border markers," Aiden continued, his voice carrying something that was not quite anger, but was adjacent to it in the way that responsibility sits adjacent to guilt. "He should have been intercepted before he reached Varn land. He wasn't." A pause. "I am dealing with the failure that allowed that." "You're telling me this because you were the one who stood in front of him," he said. "You are owed the explanation." Sadie set her cup down. She looked at him across the simple table, in the cold morning light of a courtyard that smelled of stone and frost and the faint wood smoke drifting from the hall behind them, and she tried to locate the angle. The calculation. The thing he wanted from her that made this conversation useful to him. She could not find it. "What did you see?" she said. "Last night, when you looked at me." He did not answer immediately. He looked at her with the same quality of attention she had first registered in the hall. Assessing, but not coldly. The way someone looks when they are deciding how honest to be. "Someone," he said finally, "who did not wait for permission." She held his gaze. "That's a dangerous quality," she said. "Most alphas find it inconvenient." "Most alphas," he said, with a flatness that suggested his opinion of most alphas was not particularly elevated, "are inconvenienced by things they should have the sense to value." The wind moved through the courtyard. Somewhere in the ivy on the far wall, a small bird was working at something with focused industry. The frost on the stone flags was beginning to soften at the edges where the early light reached. Sadie thought about Cole, about the sound of the hall murmuring approval at Mira Connell crossing the floor, about the woman who had said a beta doesn't bind himself to no blood with the casual cruelty of someone who had never once considered that she might be heard. She thought about her mother's dress, still folded on the chair in the guest room above. "I should tell you," she said, "that I have no clan, no lineage worth naming, and no political value to anyone in this hall or any other." "I know," he said. "I'm telling you so that whatever this conversation is," she gestured between them, simply, "you know exactly what you're speaking with." Aiden was quiet for a moment, then, "I know what I'm speaking with," he said. "I knew before you sat down. It was not flattery. It did not have the texture of flattery. No softness in the delivery, no performance of warmth designed to dissolve resistance. It had the texture of a man who dealt in assessments and was giving her one plainly." She picked up her cup again, drank. "Zev said you wanted to speak with me," she said, "so speak." And for the first time that morning, something that was almost a smile crossed Aiden's face. He spoke for longer than she expected. Not in the way men spoke when they were trying to impress, filling air with volume and trajectory, building elaborate structures of words designed to make the listener feel small enough to need them. Aiden spoke the way he did everything else, with economy, with precision, and with the particular directness of someone who had long ago stopped caring whether his meaning was comfortable to receive. He told her about the Northern High Seat. Not its history, not its political architecture. She could learn those things from any record in any hall library. He told her what it actually was. A territory so large that its borders touched 4 other packlands. A seat of authority that had been contested 3 times in 2 generations and held each time not by ceremony but by force of will. A place where weakness was not punished so much as it was simply consumed. absorbed by the landscape and the demands of the wolves who lived within it. "I have held it for 11 years, he said. "In that time I have had 3 betas, 2 of whom I trusted completely. I have negotiated 14 border disputes, resolved 9 of them without bloodshed. The remaining 5 required something less diplomatic." A pause. "I tell you this not to perform authority. I tell you so you understand the weight of what I govern, and can form an honest opinion of whether you want any part of it." Sadie turned her cup slowly in her hands. "Why would I want any part of it?" she said. It was not a challenge. It was a real question. "You might not," he said, with the same equanimity. "That's why I'm asking instead of assuming." She looked at him. "What exactly are you asking?" "I want you to come to the Northern High Seat," he said, "not as a ward, not as a political arrangement, as someone I am choosing to bring into my house because I have spent 11 years surrounded by people who wait for permission before they act. And last night, you reminded me what it looks like when someone doesn't." The courtyard was very quiet. "You're asking me to leave," she said slowly. "A territory where I have almost nothing, to go to one where I have absolutely nothing, based on one night." "Based on one night," he confirmed. "And based on the fact that the scent of your blood when you stood in front of that rogue did not smell like fear." He looked at her directly. "It smelled like certainty. That is not a common thing." Sadie was quiet for a long moment. The frost on the flagstones had melted almost entirely now. The small bird in the ivy had gone. "I need to think," she said. "Take the day," he said. No pressure in it. No performance of patience designed to make her feel grateful for being given time. Simply, the day was hers to use. She stood. He stood when she did, which she had not expected, and which she did not comment on. She was almost at the courtyard entrance when she stopped. "The rogue," she said, without turning. "The wolf I stood in front of." "What happens to him?" A pause behind her. "He'll be assessed by our healers. If there is something to recover, we will recover it. If there isn't, he will not suffer." Another pause, slightly longer. "You're asking because you want to know if we are the kind of people who discard broken things." She turned then. He was watching her with that steady, unreadable attention. "Yes," she said. "We are not," he said. She held his gaze for one more moment. Then she left. Petra was in the guest corridor when Sadie returned, sitting on the stone floor outside her room with her back against the wall and her knees pulled up, and an expression that had clearly been waiting there for some time. "How long have you been sitting there?" Sadie asked. "Long enough to have opinions," Petra said, standing. "Which I will share whether you want them or not, because that is the nature of our friendship, and you knew this when you kept me around." Sadie opened the door. They went in. Petra sat on the end of the bed with the focused energy of someone about to deliver a considered position. "The Alpha King," Petra said. "Petra, I'm just saying the words. The Alpha King, of the Northern High Seat, had private breakfast with you, in a courtyard, with 2 cups and no audience." She paused. "And Zev told me, 'Do not look at me like that,'" he started the conversation, "that Aiden has not attended a gathering in 4 years. He came to this one." Another pause, more weighted. 3 days after rogue activity was reported on his eastern border, which puts his travel window at, "He came because of the border situation," Sadie said. "Maybe," Petra allowed. "And maybe he also reviewed the attendance records before he came, which would be a very normal and administrative thing to do. And maybe your name was in those records. And maybe, just theoretically, a wolf with the tracking instincts of an Alpha King noted something about that name that he filed away for later reference." She looked at Sadie steadily. "I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm saying it's a possible sequence of events." Sadie sat in the chair by the window. Outside, the forest was fully lit now, the morning having settled into a pale, clear cold. She could see the tree line from here, dark pines pressing up against the gray sky, the kind of landscape that felt ancient regardless of the season. "He asked me to come to the Northern High Seat," she said. Petra was silent for exactly 3 seconds. "As what?" she said carefully. "He didn't put a formal name to it." Sadie looked at her hands. "He said as someone he's choosing to bring into his house." "Sadie." "I know. That is..." Petra stopped, Reassembled. That is a significant thing to say. For a man like that, in that position. That is not a casual invitation, I know. Sadie said again. What did you say? That I needed to think. Petra exhaled. Then she crossed the room and sat on the arm of the chair, which was not really built for two people, but had hosted both of them in various configurations since they were young enough not to care about comfort. What are you actually afraid of? Petra asked. Not unkindly, with the precision of someone who knew the difference between stated hesitation and real hesitation. Sadie looked at the tree line for a long moment. That it's the same thing, she said, finally. Different man, different hall, but the same fundamental structure. Someone decides I'm worth something, and I rearrange myself around that decision, and then the world reminds us both that I'm not. Petra was quiet for a moment. Then, Cole decided you were worth something the way someone decides a coat is worth something, she said. Because it's available and it fits and it's better than nothing. She paused. What I saw last night, in the hall, when that man looked at you, that was not a man looking at available. Sadie did not answer. Also, Petra added, and I say this with complete love, you stood in front of a rogue wolf last night with no weapon because a child was on the floor. You are not, historically, someone who lets fear make the decision. So I find it interesting that you're considering letting it make this one. The fire had burned lower. The room smelled of wood smoke and the faint lavender that had been pressed into the wool blankets. Sadie thought about the courtyard, the simple table. 2 cups. I know what I'm speaking with. I knew before you sat down. She thought about Cole's face when he stepped back. The particular expression of a man who has calculated too late. She thought about her mother's hands moving over this dress in the lamplight, stitch by patient stitch. And what her mother had always said. The only thing that belongs to you completely is what you decide to do when no one else is moving. She had moved last night. She could move again. She found Aiden in the late afternoon near the stables at the edge of the hall grounds, standing with Dorian over a map spread across a mounting block, while Zev sat on the fence beside them eating an apple, with the focused contentment of someone who considered logistics other people's problem. She crossed the yard toward them, and Zev saw her first. His eyebrows rose. He said nothing. Which she was beginning to understand was how he communicated the things he considered significant. Dorian looked up. His expression did not change, but he folded one corner of the map back, with a deliberateness that suggested he was creating space. Aiden turned. She stopped a few feet away and looked at him in the low afternoon light, which was doing something honest to the angles of his face. No torchlight flattery, no ceremony. Just a man who had asked her a real question this morning and meant it. I have one condition, she said. He waited. Petra comes, she said. She's not a ward. She's not staff. She comes as herself, with whatever standing that merits in your house, and she is treated accordingly. Something moved in Aiden's expression. The full version of that small adjustment she had been catching fragments of since the night before. It lasted only a moment before settling back into composure, but she saw it clearly enough. Done, he said. From the fence, Zev took a very deliberate bite of his apple. Welcome to the north, he said, with great satisfaction, and Dorian put his hand over his eyes. The northern high seat was not what she had imagined. She had constructed a version of it in her mind during the 3 days of travel north. Something fortress-like and severe. All sharp angles and cold stone, a place built for governance rather than living. What she found instead was a structure that had grown rather than been designed, expanded across generations by wolves who had added to it according to need rather than aesthetic, so that the result was something layered and asymmetrical and unexpectedly alive. Towers of different heights connected by covered walkways, courtyards at different elevations. A great hall with a roof high enough that the upper beams disappeared into shadow, hung with the banners of every pack that had ever sworn allegiance to the northern seat, dozens of them, faded and new, and every stage in between. It smelled of pine resin and iron and bread, baking somewhere deep in the interior. And beneath all of it, that particular scent she had first caught in Varn Hall. Ancient wood and cold rain, permeating the stone itself, as though the place and the man had been absorbing each other for so long they could no longer be separated. Petra stood beside her in the entrance courtyard and said, very quietly, "All right, I see it." "See what?" Sadie said. "Why you said yes." Sadie did not answer, But she did not deny it either. The weeks that followed had their own particular rhythm. Aiden did not overwhelm her with the territory or its demands. He did not install her in a ceremonial role or present her to the pack with fanfare before she had found her footing. What he did instead was something she had not anticipated. He let her move through the seat at her own pace, learn its layout and its people on her own terms, and simply included her. In the morning assessments where his betas reported on the territory's condition. In the evening councils where border matters were discussed, not as a guest, not as an ornament, as someone whose presence was unremarkable because it was assumed to belong. She made mistakes. She did not yet know the full hierarchy of the pack, and twice she addressed senior wolves with less formal deference than protocol required. The first time, Aiden corrected her quietly afterward, without audience, with the specific tone of someone giving information, rather than administering correction. The second time, Dorian intercepted the situation before it could develop, smoothly and without comment, and she understood that she had acquired something like protection she had not asked for, and had not needed to ask for. Zev taught her the territory's history on a series of walks through the upper corridors of the seat, delivering information in his particular style, accurate, well-sourced, and wrapped in a running commentary on the personality failures of various historical figures that made it impossible to be bored. The third expansion, he said, gesturing at a section of wall where older stone met newer, was done by Aiden's grandfather, who was by all accounts a man of tremendous military instinct and genuinely terrible interpersonal judgment. He won 4 border wars and alienated every ally he made in the process. Aiden spent the first 3 years of his rule rebuilding relationships the old man had burned down. A pause. He does not talk about it. But you'll find that there are certain pack names he handles with particular care. And now you know why. She filed it away. She filed away many things. The way the pack moved around Aiden, not with fear, though the capacity for fear was certainly present, but with something more like gravity. He was the center around which the seat organized itself, and he carried that not as performance, but as simple fact. She watched him in councils and in the training yard and at the evening table, and she found, consistently, that the thing she had first noticed about him in Varn Hall held true in every context. He watched more than he spoke, and when he spoke, it landed with the weight of something that had been considered fully before being released. He noticed her noticing. She knew because he was watching her notice, and they both understood this about each other, and neither of them addressed it directly for some time, which was its own form of conversation. The rogue from Varn Hall recovered. Partially, he would not regain full shift, the healer said, but his reason returned, and his name with it, Brennan. He had been a young wolf from a minor pack on the eastern edge, driven out after a dominance dispute, and the isolation had done what isolation does to wolves who are not built to survive it. When Sadie visited the healer's wing and found him sitting up and eating, she did not make an event of it. She sat across from him, and they spoke briefly about nothing consequential. And when she left, the healer at the door looked at her with an expression she did not immediately categorize. Later, Zev told her that Aiden had asked about the visit. She went to find him that evening on the upper walkway that ran along the north wall of the seat, where he stood most nights for a period before the evening council. She had learned his patterns the way she had learned the territory's layout, through observation and inference. The sky above the forest was the particular dark blue that precedes full night, and the pines below the wall were moving in a wind she could not feel from up here. Brennan is recovering, she said, standing beside him. I know, he said. I'm told you visited him. He needed someone to sit with him who wasn't staff and wasn't managing him. A pause. That was a considered thing to do, he said. It was an obvious thing to do. He turned to look at her. In the low light, his eyes were darker than their usual gray, closer to the color of the stone beneath them. You do that, he said. Take things that most people would consider generous and reclassify them as obvious, as though care is simply the logical response to a situation that requires it. She considered that. Isn't it? For you, he said, not for most. The wind moved through the pines below. Somewhere in the seat behind them, a door opened and closed. The evening was pressing down around the walls, with the particular weight of a season turning. Sadie, he said. She looked at him. I want to be clear with you about something, he said. Because I think you have spent enough of your life receiving things that were less than what they claimed to be, and I have no interest in adding to that. She was very still. What I asked you in Varn, he said, was not strategy. It was not political, and it was not calculated. He paused, and the pause had the quality of a man choosing exactness over ease. I have governed this territory for 11 years. I have made decisions in that time that cost things I would not choose to pay again. And I have learned, with considerable difficulty, the difference between what is useful and what is true. He looked at her directly. You are true. I knew it before you sat down in that courtyard, and I know it more clearly now. I am telling you this plainly because you asked me once to be plain with you. The dark blue of the sky had deepened to something close to black at the edges. Sadie thought about the girl who had walked into Varn Hall in her mother's dress, carrying hope like something borrowed. She thought about the murmur of approval that had moved through the room when Mira Connell crossed the floor. She thought about standing in the open space with the rogue's yellow eyes fixed on her and feeling not fear but arithmetic, and how the arithmetic had been simple and how she had always been good at simple arithmetic, even when the numbers were frightening. She reached out and put her hand on the stone wall beside his, not touching, adjacent, an inch of cold stone between them. He looked down at the distance between their hands. Then he closed it. His hand was warm, and the grip was certain without being forceful. And when she looked up at him, there was nothing in his face that she needed to interpret or excuse or translate into something more manageable. It was exactly what it was. All right, she said quietly. All right, he said. Spring came to the northern high seat with the specific intention of making the winter's severity seem exaggerated. The pack celebrated it the way northern wolves celebrated most things, with food and fire and a volume level that suggested the hall's stone walls were a suggestion rather than a boundary. Sadie stood near the main hearth with Petra, who had spent the winter becoming something between an informal archivist and an unofficial diplomatic coordinator, primarily because she had strong opinions about how the seat's records were organized and had shared those opinions with enough directness that Aiden's Beta Harlan had simply given her a room and access to the archives to resolve the situation. I have been given a title, Petra announced, appearing at Sadie's shoulder with a cup of spring wine and an expression of profound self-satisfaction. Junior Keeper of Records. Harlan made it up specifically for me. I have decided to consider it an honor. It is an honor, Sadie said. It absolutely is. Petra looked out at the hall, at the wolves gathered around the long tables, the children running between the benches, the banners moving in the warm air rising from the fires. I keep thinking about where we were a year ago. Don't, Sadie said, not unkindly. I'm not being maudlin. I'm being grateful. There's a difference. Petra looked at her. You're happy. It was not a question. Sadie considered it anyway, the way she considered things that deserved consideration. Yes, she said, simply, with the specific weight of someone who does not say things they do not mean. Cole Heron arrived at the spring border meeting. She did not know he would be there until he walked into the outer courtyard where the territorial representatives were gathering, and she watched him absorb the situation in the slow, sequential way of someone whose mind requires several steps to reach conclusions. He saw her standing with Dorian and Zev near the courtyard entrance. He saw the northern high seat around her, its weight, its banners, its wolves who moved around her, with the easy familiarity of people who have absorbed someone as one of their own. He saw Aiden cross the courtyard, and stop beside her, and say something low enough that only she could hear. And the way she turned toward him, Cole's face did the thing she had expected it to do, which was to finally, fully, understand the arithmetic that she had worked out in Varn Hall the night he stepped back and said nothing. She did not feel satisfaction. She did not feel bitterness. What she felt was something much quieter. The clean, settled absence of a weight she had been carrying for years, without fully recognizing its shape until she put it down. Aiden's hand found the small of her back. A light touch. Simply present. She did not look at Cole again. The formal bonding ceremony was held at midsummer, under the open sky in the upper courtyard, with the pack assembled on every level of the seat above and around them until the stone itself seemed populated. Lord Varn officiated, which Zev said was Aiden's way of making a point about what the northern high seat thought of Varn Hall's hospitality that night, a point he delivered without a single explicit word, which Zev considered one of the finest political gestures of the decade. Sadie wore a dress the color of deep water, made by a seamstress in the seat's village, who had asked for no direction beyond Sadie's measurements, and one instruction: make it something she'll want to wear again. She wore her mother's gray dress beneath it, folded against her skin, close to her chest, where it belonged. When Aiden took her hands and looked at her in front of every wolf who had sworn to the Northern High Seat, he said what he had always said, clearly, without performance, in the exact words he meant. I knew what I was choosing. I would choose it again. She believed him. Not because she needed to. Because she had spent enough time learning the difference between words that were built to be believed and words that were simply true, and these were simply true. By autumn, the healers confirmed what she had already suspected. Aiden received the news with the particular stillness of a man for whom significant things land quietly rather than loudly. And then he looked at her with something in his gray eyes that she had no name for but did not need one. It was simply there, clear and complete. Zev cried. He denied it immediately and attributed the evidence to an unfavorable wind direction, and Dorian handed him a cloth without comment, which was the most Dorian had ever expressed on any subject. Petra stood in the doorway of the healer's wing with her hands over her mouth, and her eyes bright, and said nothing at all, which was the loudest thing she had ever communicated. The Northern High Seat settled into its winter with the particular weight of a place that has found its full occupancy. Every room inhabited, every role filled, every wolf belonging to a structure that held them. The pines beyond the walls moved in the cold wind. The fires burned high in the great hall. The banners hung still in the warm air above the long tables, where the pack ate and argued and laughed with the volume of people who do not need to perform contentment because they simply have it. Sadie sat at the head table beside Aiden with her hands warm and her shoulders finally, completely still. She had walked into a hall in her mother's dress carrying borrowed hope, and she had been told in a dozen ways, some loud and some quiet, that she was not enough for the room she was standing in. She had stood in an open space with nothing but herself and moved anyway. And she had learned, in the end, that the wolves who could not see her value had not diminished it by a single thread. They had only ever been looking with the wrong eyes.